In spite of all of this, I would have to tell you that the prejudice I experienced as a woman is nothing compared to that I've experienced as a lesbian. In this culture, women may have second-class status in some areas. Gays and lesbians have no status at all. I want you to imagine what it's like to spend most of your days among coworkers who freely discuss their spouses, the date they had last night, the new person they met that they were attracted to, and you're forced to stay silent, or worse yet, you feel compelled to lie so no one will know that you are gay. I want you to imagine what it is like to know that one slip of the tongue, yours or someone else's, might cost you your job, your promotion, your apartment, your credit, your insurance, or your children.
For every one of the gay, lesbian, and bisexual speakers here tonight supporting this ordinance, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of others in this city who would like to be here but are not. The reason is that they are afraid. For years they have lived in a city where people of different sexual orientation often lose their jobs, homes, insurance, everything. Sometimes they are harassed, sometimes worse. 4 years ago, SMSU presented a controversial play dealing with AIDS and homosexuality. During the battle which resulted from the play's subject matter, an actor's home was burned to the ground and his pets died in the fire. The arsonists were never found nor arrested. Many citizens of Springfield know stories of homosexuals being threatened and abused outside of local gay bars, of cars being vandalized in parking lots near those bars, and of gay and bisexual men who have been chased, beaten, and robbed in public places. But most Springfield citizens don't know those stories because many such crimes are never reported. Their victims are too afraid.
Sadly, I must say that nowhere I've lived have I seen a greater need for an anti-bias crimes ordinance than the city of Springfield. I've heard racism directed against African Americans and Native Americans. I've heard people speak of Christianity as if it were the only religion and somehow the only model of goodness and morality, as if other religions and cultures such as Judaism did not exist, let alone measure up to Christianity's moral standards. Most of all, however, I have observed homophobia, that disease, that fear and disgust toward even the topic of homosexuality, and a hatred toward gay men and lesbians, and anyone who speaks in favor of gay rights, of civil rights for gay and lesbian citizens. And I'm aware that all of us who are speaking in favor of this ordinance, particularly for the inclusion of the sexual orientation clause, are putting ourselves and our property in danger.
Rational voices of decent people of all orientations have been silenced in controversies like this by fear of social disapproval. In the face of unethical persuasion, sensible people are now speaking up.
A group of supporters speaks out on the bias crimes ordinance. Welcome to Color 10 Newsbeat, everyone. I'm Steve LaRocco. Members of the NAACP, AIDS Project of the Ozarks, the Diversity Network, and others have formed a group in support of the bias crimes ordinance on the upcoming February ballot. The group calls itself COHAB, Citizens Opposed to Hatred and Bigotry. And Color 10 Newsbeat's Joe Dawes listened to their message today.
They have spread hatred and bigotry in our community under the aegis of churches that call themselves Christian.
The words were blunt, and the message was clear.
We have come to realize that some local groups which oppose the bias crimes ordinance are actually a vehicle for the agenda of national right-wing extremist organizations. They preach a doctrine of hatred and intolerance towards homosexuals and anyone else who does not agree with them.
COHAB's immediate mission is to campaign for the bias crimes ordinance.
These crimes rip apart the pluralistic fabric of American society.
The group is comprised of a rabbi, a minister, doctors, professors, and members of the local AIDS Project, the NAACP, and Diversity Network.
The bias crimes ordinance will not stop hate crimes, but it may make those who commit them think twice.
I was more humored by many of the comments they made.
To opponents of the bias crimes ordinance, listen to the charges from the back row.
The homosexual lifestyle is being legitimized, and that's what this does. And that is the sole purpose of this ordinance.
Today's press conference could be the beginning of a media barrage on the bias crimes issue ahead of the February 8th election.
We learn more. It's not like we're professional, like a professional group all of a sudden.
None of us are.
We're practicing all the time. But we become more, we realize our strengths, and we realize that we can rely on each other to take care of other details. Okay. And it becomes a process like that.
I wonder if I might add to that one of our strengths that sometimes gives us problems is that we are truly a local organization. This organization, unlike people who oppose the bias crimes ordinance, is not taking direction, is not getting its propaganda from outside the community. And in a way, this has been a collective effort of local people.
Southwest Missouri, you'd say?
Southwest Missouri, and largely from the area immediately around Springfield. And as a consequence, we've had to learn on the job. I think unlike many of the people who have been opposing the bias crimes ordinance.
Okay. Basically, one of the best ways we've discussed in education is just being here and being visible and see, it's not exactly the media representation. Everybody has a life, everybody has jobs. This is who we are. We're real people. We're in this community. We are part of the community. We're not just some radical out there screaming at the top of our lungs.
Why is it worse to kill somebody if you don't like them because they're black or they're gay or they're whatever than to just kill them? Why do we need more enforcement?
I think the key to that is that bias crimes terrorize whole groups of people. If there were an attack against vandalism at a Baptist church, I think people who are Baptists would be really worried about that.
That they were being picked on just because they were Baptists.
Exactly. And so that makes a bias crime worse. In addition to that, there are studies which demonstrate that the victims of bias crimes suffer more than victims of either random violence or violence that comes through confrontation. Probably because, in some sense, if you get into a fight, you've chosen to do that. But, on the other hand, if you're a victim of hate against a category of person, you have no real explanation, in a sense, for what's happened to you. I think there's ample documentation that hate crimes have a stronger effect.
Tomorrow, Springfield voters will decide whether the city will have a bias crimes ordinance.
The battle for ballots continues up until the very last minute. News Team 33's Ken Fields is in the newsroom now to tell us how this political fight has turned personal. Ken?
Patrick, both sides in this campaign held last-minute press conferences that turned into rallies for their sides. Now they are trying to rally public support for their positions.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the COHAB news conference.
On the day before the election, people who support the bias crimes bill meet on the steps of Springfield's old city hall. They say the ordinance would give the city a new weapon to fight hate.
I hope the citizens of Springfield remember that this is simply a human rights issue. That's it, a human rights issue.
And I urge people to remember that this law covers all of us, all of us. So please vote for it.
But debate about the proposal that would increase penalties for hate crimes leads to some new arguments and some old wounds.
These might be the people who wouldn't wanted me to vote a few years ago. Probably still don't want me to vote or say anything, but still, I'm here.
It has nothing to do with color. It has nothing to do with color. And black people with a sense of morality and with a sense of being Americans first will vote against it.
Does not have morality. Carolyn Moncrief does not have morality.
Probably not.
I hope you got that.
Opponents of the ordinance meet to talk about why they think the bill will provide special rights for homosexuals. It does include sexual orientation among protected groups.
Every person in this room, every person in this city is currently protected under existing laws. I would challenge anybody to identify any person or any group that is not now protected against assault and property damage.
Those against the bias crimes ordinance say it would be unfair, unenforceable, and unconstitutional.
You can't legislate love and compassion for others different from yourself. That has to come from the heart.
Those opponents say they think the bias crimes ordinance is a bad bill, but they say they would have dropped their opposition to it if supporters of the plan had dropped the sexual orientation language from it. That did not happen, so the voters will decide tomorrow.
Springfield voters face a ballot with several hot issues when they go to the polls tomorrow. One of the cities is the bias crimes ordinance. Those who support the ordinance rallied this morning on the steps of City Hall. The law would increase the punishment for criminals if it's determined the crime was motivated by a bias toward race, gender, nationality, religion, or sexual orientation. A group opposed to the bias crimes ordinance also rallied this afternoon. They opposed the sexual orientation clause of the bill, saying it amounts to a gay rights bill. Greene County officials predict interest in the bias crimes issue will generate a better than usual turnout for a February election.
Welcome to Color 10 Newsbeat, everyone. I'm Steve LaRocco. After months of discussion about the bias crimes issue, Springfield voters last night repealed a city ordinance that would have increased penalties for those convicted of assault or property damage because of bias. Opponents of the ordinance said the law gave extra rights to homosexuals. Some of those same people are working on a statewide petition drive called the Amendment Coalition. Color 10 Newsbeat's Joe Dawes has more on the progress of the group in the wake of the Springfield vote. Joe?
Steve, when the ballots were counted, the outcome was clear. More than 70% of the voters turned down the idea of extra criminal penalties for people convicted of a bias crime.
It's just the beginning, actually. It's not the end, because now we're going full tilt on the Amendment Coalition effort to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot in '94. So we can't stop now. We just take this victory and go on.
And going on for Paul Summers means leading the Southwest Missouri petition signature effort for the Amendment Coalition.
We're in the signature gathering process, still trying to get the petitions. We have until July the 8th this summer as the final date to get them into the Secretary of State.
Here's how the petition reads. Neither the state of Missouri through any of its branches or agencies, nor any of its political subdivisions, shall enact, adopt, or enforce any statute or policy whereby homosexual, lesbian, or bisexual activity, conduct, or orientation shall entitle any person to demand minority status, affirmative action, or claim of discrimination.
If someone were, say, fired for being gay, they would have no legal recourse. If someone is thrown out of their apartment for being gay, they would have no legal recourse. That would be a legal form of discrimination. They could be refused jobs. They could be refused housing.
Not simply those who are in the majority.
The Springfield group Citizens Opposed to Hatred and Bigotry fought for the Bias Crimes Ordinance and plans to fight against the Amendment Coalition.
I think anybody who reads the Amendment Coalition proposal will understand that it's simply not constitutional. It's very un-American.
We have no confidence at all that the legislature or the governor would try to put this thing through. We know that even if we found somebody to submit it to the legislature, it'd probably die in committee.
A Cole County judge has dismissed a lawsuit challenging the petition drive on the grounds that it contained too many subjects. Right now, organizers say there are at least 7,500 petitions being circulated around the state. The group needs to collect 8% of the total votes cast in the 1992 gubernatorial election. That amounts to at least 120,000 signatures.
Joe, if the amendment passes, what would happen to Missouri cities who've already enacted protection for homosexuals?
Well, basically, a constitutional amendment would nullify those local ordinances, but opponents of the proposal say even if the amendment were approved with a statewide vote, it could still be ruled unconstitutional.